Olá, meus amigos e amigas! Que momento especial! Vamos ter aqui uma conversa histórica para o ICL, uma conversa histórica para todos e todas que estão aqui nos assistindo. A gente vai conversar com um dos maiores intelectuais do mundo. Os seus cursos, as suas palestras têm sido assistidos literalmente por dezenas de milhões de pessoas. Ele é professor de filosofia política na Universidade de Harvard, nos Estados Unidos, e os seus livros são um enorme sucesso no mundo inteiro, já tendo sido traduzido para diversas línguas. E aqui no Brasil estão sempre no topo da lista de mais vendidos. Dear Professor Michael Sandel, it's a great pleasure to have you here at ICL talking to dozens of thousands of people that are readers of your books and admirers of your work. Hello.
Hello, it's great to be with you. It's an honor to be with you, Eduardo. And I have only one request, and that is that you call me Michael.
Oh, great. Really, sometimes I think that if I die tomorrow, I have accomplished all my goals here, because Noam Chomsky asked me to call him Noam. Now Michael Sandel asked him to call him Michael. So I think I aced my test. Dear Michael, let's start. Our conversation today will be mostly about your book, The Tyranny of Merit, in Portuguese, A Tirania do Mérito, What's Become of the Common Good, in Portuguese, O que aconteceu com o bem comum. But first, I would like to make a few questions about another book you have written, and in Brazil has been one of the greatest successes of all time, which is Justice. What is the right thing to do? Justiça, o que é fazer a coisa certa, da editora Civilização Brasileira. And in Brazil, we call the whole legal system by the name justice. And people use the expression, at least in Portuguese, like this is just or this is unjust, sometimes to mean legal, sometimes to mean fair, sometimes to mean appropriate. And I wonder if this is the reason why people disagree so much on what is and what is not just. Is justice something that necessarily make people better off? Is it something necessarily good? And what is justice, Michael?
Well, you've begun, Eduardo, with one of the biggest questions in political philosophy. I would say that justice means giving people their due. This is how Aristotle defined justice. But as you say, Eduardo, we argue endlessly about justice, about what makes for a just society, about what counts as justice in the way we treat one another in personal life, in our personal lives, as well as in public life. The debates begin when we begin to try to figure out who deserves what and why. And so the question of what kind of treatment do we owe one another? That's really the starting point for debates about justice, Eduardo.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And it reminds me comic strip I have read once from Calvin and Hobbes. Do you know Calvin and Hobbes?
Yeah.
I think, yeah, in Brazil it's not that popular as it is in the United States, but it is pretty popular. We call him Calvin and Haroldo in Brazil. And on this strip, Calvin complains about a punishment he received from his mom for not behaving well. And then Hobbes tell him that the world is not fair. And then Calvin tells Hobbes that there's no problem of the world being unfair. The problem is not being unfair in his favor. So right. In this sense of justice that Calvin used on the comic strip, I see a lot of how people treat justice. That's something that is useful to promote when it's in their favor, but it's something that can be treated in some other way when it's not for their benefit.
Right.
How can we guarantee that everyone sees justice the same way?
The short answer is we can't guarantee that everyone sees justice in the same way, which is why political philosophers have been arguing about justice. And ordinary citizens like us have been arguing about justice for a very long time. The Calvin and Hobbes definition that you just mentioned, Eduardo, goes back to the origins of philosophy in the Western tradition, because Plato begins by asking or considering the possibility that justice is simply whatever the most powerful person defines as being in his interest. And so in the dialogues of Socrates in the Republic, in his famous book, The Republic, there's a dialogue between Socrates and Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus argues, much as Calvin and Hobbes suggest, that justice is simply defined by the powerful, whatever serves the interests of the powerful. And Socrates questions Thrasymachus about this and leads us who are observing this dialogue to see that justice can't only be about interests, can't only be defined by the most powerful. Justice is an ideal of the way to organize our lives together. It's an ideal of how we should treat one another. So it can never take its meaning from the interests of this person or that person, however powerful they may be. There is always a standpoint from which we can criticize, evaluate, assess existing laws, existing social and economic arrangements. And there's no guarantee we will agree once those debates begin. But what's important to see at the outset is these are debates about the way the world ought to be. They're not descriptions about the way the world happens to be, about the way power happens to be arrayed at any given moment. So I suppose another way of putting your question, Eduardo, is not what guarantees that we'll agree, because we don't agree about what makes for a just society, but how can we create the conditions within which we can disagree about justice with civility and mutual respect? How can we create the conditions in our public life for reasoned debate and disagreement about what justice requires, and still regard those with whom we disagree as fellow citizens worthy of respect? That, I think, is the question we face today. It's a question for educators like us. It's also a question for democratic citizens.
And this is very interesting, because brings me to the next question that I have prepared, which has a lot to do with the moment we're living in Brazil. There's a perception in Brazil, in other countries of the world too, but in Brazil, this is very strong, that institutions are very corrupt, and mainly the public institutions. Politicians in Brazil are perceived by a relevant portion of the population all to be corrupt. And this has, in the recent times, strengthened the extreme right movements in Brazil that defend a rupture with this democratic system and a shift of power to the armed forces and to the police, and also to an authoritarian regime. Right. We have a very sad past of dictatorship regime here in Brazil. Why so many people still in 2022 believe that the armed forces, the police, will make like a more just country where people could like all be defended, protected, and agreeing on how the world should be?
Well, this is an enormously important question, especially for the current moment. And while it's true, Eduardo, that Brazil has a history of military governments, but now has been in a democratic era, it's also true that other democracies around the world now live under the shadow of authoritarian possibilities. We've seen that in the United States with Trump and with his refusal to acknowledge the results of the election and the invasion of the US Capitol on January 6th, the violent assault on the Capitol. So I think we all have to take seriously the threat to democracy posed by authoritarian possibilities. And that means we have to ask ourselves the question, Eduardo, that you just raised. Why is it that many people are drawn to a kind of authoritarian alternative to democratic life, democratic institutions? I think one of the reasons is this. Democracy, even at its best, is a messy and uncertain way of governing ourselves, because democracy welcomes and depends upon disagreement. It depends upon the idea that citizens like us, who disagree about big moral questions, who disagree about how to deal with inequality, who disagree about what it means to respect basic rights, who disagree on questions such as what do we owe one another as fellow citizens. These disagreements can often seem impossible to resolve. And so it's tempting to seek a way of governing ourselves that overcomes the tumult and the uncertainty of democratic disagreement. And this hunger for a kind of authoritarian alternative is strengthened at a time when there is corruption in government and when there are deep and persisting inequalities. It's also tempting at a time when public discourse, democratic discourse, seems empty and hollow, which it has been in our societies in recent decades. And so part of what concerns me is how to invigorate the terms of democratic public discourse so that democratic citizens feel engaged, feel that their voice matters, and feel that public debate is about big questions that matter, including what does it mean to seek a just society? What should we do about rising inequality? What should be the role of money and markets in a good society? What do we owe one another as fellow citizens? I think democratic citizens everywhere want public life to be about big questions, including big ethical questions such as these. And when we have a narrow, hollow public discourse that fails to address these big questions, that leaves citizens feeling disempowered, then I think we open the way toward narrow, intolerant answers to those questions of the kind that are offered by authoritarian right-wing populist figures such as we have seen in recent decades. So I think there is a genuine danger. And the only way of addressing that danger is to deepen and enrich and to make the public discourse so that it really does address big questions that citizens care about.
Perfect. And we're gonna now start talking about this book. And this book really was a shift in my way of seeing one of the themes that I have most talked about in my life, which is meritocracy, because I have always debated meritocracy as something that we should find a way where it could be implemented, and we should find a way to guarantee that we could make it like the main foundation of a just society. And then when I started reading your book, you make like a question that should come first, which is a society that lives a new topic, perfect meritocratic system, is that society a good society to live in? Is a society where those who are in the top really, really far away from those who are in the bottom, like a society that because you have a reason, you have an excuse, you have a motive for those who are in the top to be in the top, that society would be a good society for everyone to live? So I would like to start with this question. Is meritocracy like a formula that would make a society where everyone will be better off than they are today?
Well, I'm intrigued, Eduardo, by your suggestion that the book challenged your own meritocratic convictions. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. But let me see if I can guess why you held those convictions, at least initially. And then we can talk about whether meritocracy is an adequate ideal for a good society. In many ways, meritocracy is a very attractive, even liberating ideal. Because if the alternative way of distributing income and wealth and power and opportunities and social roles is a hereditary aristocracy, then meritocracy seems like a much more fair, much more equal system. Or if the alternative is a system of nepotism and corruption and clientelism, if that's how opportunities are distributed, then assigning social roles on the basis of merit seems like a welcome alternative. It seems like a way to equality. The only alternatives are nepotism and corruption and clientelism. So I see the force of that. And yet, even if, here's the paradox, I think, you'll tell me if you agree or disagree, Eduardo, even if we could achieve a society where everyone started out at the same starting line, and then the race began, even if we could achieve that, would we have a just society? Would we have a good society? It seems to me we wouldn't, for a couple of reasons. First, if we think of social life in the image of a race, that already accepts that there will be winners and there will be losers. It accepts that the winners, provided the race is fair, the winners will be able to think of themselves as deserving their winnings. And by implication, the losers will have to think of themselves as deserving their fate. But do we really want to think of social life in that way? Part of what prompted me to write the book was trying to make sense of the election of 2016 in the United States, the election of Donald Trump, and the fact that many working people whose lives were not improved by Donald Trump's policies, many working people voted for him. Why was that? A lot of it had to do with the sense that elites were looking down on ordinary working people. Educated elites, highly credentialed elites, professionals were looking down. Why was this? I think one of the reasons, and I think this is a legitimate grievance, a legitimate complaint, one of the reasons for this is that in recent decades, those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve all the benefits the market bestows upon them. And by implication, that those who struggle must deserve their fate too. Now, this way of thinking about success, Eduardo, reflects the meritocratic ideal. And it leads to a kind of hubris. I call it meritocratic hubris among the winners. It leads the winners to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on our way, that helped us on our way. It leads us to forget our indebtedness to those who make our achievements possible. Family, teachers, community, country, the times in which we live. So if the meritocratic ideal depends on the idea, encourages the idea that we are self-made and self-sufficient and therefore deserve the winnings of the race, then meritocracy, we see that meritocracy has a dark side. It's not as liberating as it might first appear. It's not the friend of equality that it might first seem, because now meritocracy becomes not an alternative to inequality, but a justification for inequality. And this is how I think meritocracy has become corrosive of the common good, of the sense that we are all in it together. And this, I think, has fueled the anger and the resentment, the grievances and the frustration that lead many of our fellow citizens in Brazil and in the United States and in democracies around the world to be attracted to authoritarian right-wing populist figures who speak to the anger and sense of grievance that people feel when they believe that the contributions they make to the economy and to the common good are not respected or recognized, that elites are looking down on them. Well, what do you think of this critique of meritocracy and this diagnosis, Eduardo?
It makes a lot of sense, and the reason why it touched me like so in the target was that I participated a lot on the political debate. I gave speeches on the Congress in Brazil when they were discussing the pension reform in Brazil. And I used to tell the guys, I say, we cannot leave those that came before like behind with with no social protection, because the roads where we ride our cars, the light that is lighting up like this room, like the walls of the house where we're in, were built by those who came before, and we're only able like to learn what we learn, to do the professions we do now, because some people like helped to build an infrastructure, to build like a set of knowledge, a set of possibilities that we now use. So we have to, we have to retribute to the common good. We have to understand that different from other species on Earth, we are species that a new generation always start from where the last generation left. All the other species have to start from scratch, to start from zero. So we depend on like on the common good. And if we only think because the government, the people, the market people, they were defending that we should only have the capitalization regime, which is you save, and at the end of your life, your retirement is the much you saved. So no one helps anyone, you know. And I was against that. So when you ask that question, but wait a minute, you're not questioning the competition. You're still in the competition mode. And that's so hard, Michael, because from the first years of school, at least here in Brazil, I studied in the United States. I went to high school in the United States. You're already competing. You learn to compete. So the paradigm where we live in from the first years of our life is the paradigm of competition. There's a program in Brazil, supposedly like a philanthropic, like a very nice program, which I couldn't disagree more. Which some of the wealthiest guys in Brazil, they go into the slums, the poor people in Brazil, and then they give tests, IQ tests, to the poor people. And then those who get the best results on the IQ tests, they pay for their schools, they send them to Stanford, Oxford, Harvard, and then they come back to Brazil and they hire them on their companies. I think this is cruel. This is because can you imagine living in a slum and then doing a test, which is maybe the only chance in your life to leave that like a very, very sad situation of your life, and then you fail this test. You're left with the sensation that you're not worth anything. So that's why your book touched me so deep, and it makes so much sense for me. But the challenge is how to exit this competition paradigm, which we learn to live in from the very first years of our life.
We do begin to, we learn from the first years of our life to live in this way. I have a story in the book about a math class I was in when I was, maybe 15 years old. And I think it may have been a geometry class or an algebra class. Do you remember the story where after each exam and each test, each quiz, the teacher would announce a new seating plan in the classroom, because the first 3 rows in the classroom of desks, we were assigned on the basis of our grade point average as of that moment. So the person with the highest grades in the math class sat in the first desk, and those with the second highest grade sat in the second desk and the third. And the result was there was tremendous suspense, anxiety, competition, because this was made public even. So if I didn't do so well on a math test, I might be personally disappointed privately, but it was also known publicly, because maybe now I had to sit in the third desk rather than in the second desk or in the fifth. So the way we educate young people cultivates this idea of competition. Now, the role of education here and of educational opportunity is a complicated thing, because I don't want my critique of meritocracy and my critique of making universities sorting machines for a market-driven meritocracy. I don't want anyone to misunderstand. I think encouraging young people to get a university degree is a good thing. I've spent my entire life in higher education. I think providing the financial means to enable those who can't afford a higher education to achieve it, that's a worthy aim. But what I'm criticizing is converting higher education into a sorting machine for a market-driven meritocratic society. I don't think that's good for those who failed the tests. I don't think it's good for those who succeed in the tests, because it creates, and we see among young people, and we see it in the United States, in many Asian countries that have very high stakes testing for admission to top universities, we see tremendous levels of mental health and emotional problems among young people, including anxiety and depression and very high rates of suicide, because the entire educational system is converted into a competition for access to a decent life. That's the problem. That's what we need to reconsider. And I think this converting higher education into a sorting machine is also damaging to universities themselves, because it distracts us. It diverts us from the intrinsic goods that higher education should serve, enabling young people to reflect on their lives, on their society, to figure out how they can contribute best to that society, what careers are most in line with their capacities and their passions and their dreams. cultivating the love, the intrinsic love of learning and of reading and of discussing and exploring the humanities, the liberal arts. These intrinsic goods of higher education are crowded out if we focus too single-mindedly on turning universities into the arbiters of success in a competitive, market-driven, meritocratic society. So I think we need to reconsider the role of higher education. We need to recover the intrinsic value of teaching and learning and developing oneself and exploring life possibilities in relation to history and literature and philosophy. And we should not allow the practical and the competitive aspects of meritocratic life to crowd out and to corrupt those intrinsic goods.
It makes a lot of sense. And now I want to ask you a question about something that doesn't make a lot of sense to me,
Okay.
which is the fact that we live in a country here in Brazil where inequality reaches its most scary levels in the world. Literally, in some rankings, we are number one in inequality in the world. For instance, in income inequality in the world, we're number one. And social mobility in Brazil, it's also one of the lowest ones in the world. There's a report called A Broken Social Elevator from OECD that shows Brazil as the one position before the last one in terms of social mobility. We only lose to Colombia. In Brazil, usually takes 9 generations from the people that are born in the 10% poorest people to reach the medium income in Brazil. And people that are the richest ones in Brazil, the same report from OECD shows that 70% of their economic condition comes from their parents and also from their grandparents. And don't forget that we are the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery. So from people that, are the heirs of the slavery regime in Brazil. But those who defend meritocracy in Brazil are those from, at least on their speeches, are those from this elite. Those who were born rich, those who never had to press a button to build a wall, to build anything. How can this discourse, this speech of meritocracy come from those who have no merit besides being born from in a rich family to occupy their economic condition? How people never argue against that and ask, hey, wait a minute, it makes no sense for you to defend meritocracy.
Well, this goes back to what makes meritocracy seem like an attractive ideal for a just society. The main argument for meritocracy emerged by contrast to the image of a hierarchical, aristocratic, or caste society. And the meritocratic argument was this: in a hereditary aristocracy, one's place in life and life prospects are entirely the result of the accident of birth. But that's unfair, because it's not up to me into what family I'm born. That's a matter of luck. That's what makes hereditary aristocracies unfair. Most would agree with that as a starting point. And so the question is, does meritocracy provide a genuine alternative to a society where places are allocated and opportunities are given on the basis of what one achieves rather than what one inherits? That's the issue, really. Now, in the early days of meritocracy, this was seen as its advantage. But what's happened is that if access to higher education is the primary way in which people achieve success, material success, also social recognition and political influence, then everything depends on what equips young people to prepare themselves to compete successfully for the entrance exams and the educational preparation to win that competition. What's happened in recent decades is that well-off parents have figured out how to pass their advantages onto their kids, not necessarily by bequeathing them trusts and estates, huge amounts of money, but most importantly, by equipping them with the educational and cultural advantages necessary to compete effectively, to advance in the educational system, and to win admission to the best universities. So the mode of transmission of privilege across generations is not simply a matter of birth, as in the old aristocracy. Instead, it's the ability of well-off parents to confer on their children the advantages it takes to score well on college entrance exams, to get good grades in school, to attend the best schools that equip them to succeed in the college entrance competition. And so the meritocracy has devolved into a kind of hereditary. There is a very close correlation between the scores that students receive on standardized tests. And here I'm basing this on the way it works in the United States. There's a close correlation between test scores on the standardized tests and family income. And if that's true, then essentially the meritocracy has become a kind of hereditary aristocracy, in the sense that parents can pass their advantages onto their kids. Now, I want to just say a word, Eduardo, about the mobility statistics that you mentioned. One of the ways that mainstream political parties and politicians have addressed the deepening inequality of recent decades has been not to address the inequality directly through structural reforms to the economy, but instead by offering individual upward mobility through higher education, by offering that as a kind of promise, as a response to inequality and to wage stagnation and to job loss. The politicians have said, if you're worried about inequality and falling behind in the global economy, go to university, improve yourself. What you earn will depend on what you learn. This was Bill Clinton's slogan. He repeated it time and again. You can make it if you try. That was Barack Obama. Now, it seems inspiring to tell people, if you work hard and if you get into a good university, you will be able to rise. But it's not an adequate answer to inequality. Individual mobility is not a sufficient response to inequality for the following reason. First, it isn't easy to rise. As you mentioned, in Brazil, it takes on average 9 generations for a low-income family to attain the median income. In Denmark, do you know how many generations it takes according to that same OECD?
2 or 3, right?
2. It takes 2. Yeah. And in the United States, we pride ourselves on upward mobility. It takes 2 generations in Denmark. In the United States, it takes 5 generations.
100 years.
For a low-income family to rise. So in the United States, we have told ourselves, we have comforted ourselves for a long time, saying we don't need to worry about inequality as much as those European countries. Those are class societies. Here in America, no one is consigned to the class of his or her birth. It's always possible to rise. mobility, we told ourselves, was our answer to inequality. But now it turns out that the social democracies of Europe have more mobility than the United States and certainly than Brazil, not less. So mobility is not an alternative to inequality. Greater equality is a condition of mobility. And why should, well, it makes sense if you think about it. If everyone has access to decent healthcare and nutrition and housing and education, then not only do you have a more equal society, you have greater opportunities for people to rise. But the deeper the inequality, the more difficult the mobility. So we need a new political project. We need to respond to inequality not simply by telling people to improve themselves by competing for a place at a top university. Good luck to those who can achieve that. But for most people, and we need to remember that most people don't have a university degree, not in Brazil, not in the United States, not in Europe. Most people do not have a university degree. So it's folly to design an economy that makes as a necessary condition of a decent life and dignified work a university degree that most people don't have.
Yeah, in the book that I wrote called What the Owners of Power Don't Want You to Know, I was trying to see if there was some around here, but there's not. I write something which is similar to something I read at your book, The Tyranny of Merit, which I call the effect Mr. Jack in Brazil, Seu Zé. It's a nickname, like very common here in Brazil, which is the rich people, they search for someone that was born very poor, and then like he studied, he passed to some university, he entered on a job, he did well, and now he's rich. And then he get, which this example, which is statistically irrelevant, but they get this example and say, see, if you want, you can make it. He studied hard, he worked hard, and now he has a good life. So the problem's not the system, the problem is you. But in Brazil, most of the poor people, they work 50, 60 hours a week. They spend like 3 to 4 hours a day on public transportation. They're the ones that produce wealth on the fabrics and on the fields. But this is not considered merit because they don't see their life getting better off. And the problem is the left wing, not only the people, the conservatives, the right wing, but the left wing politicians, they seem to have adopted the meritocratic paradigm as a given. So yes, their discussion is that we're not given the right conditions for a meritocratic world, but they don't question the meritocracy. Do you see that? I saw in your book, but you see that too, right? It's kind of like the left, the progressive politicians, they fell in the trap of meritocracy.
Yes, and this is a major theme of my book. I am critical of mainstream parties and politicians of the center left and the center right for just this reason, Eduardo, because in a way it goes back to the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan won office, arguing explicitly that government is the problem and markets are the solution. They offered a vision of unfettered laissez-faire capitalism as the solution. Now, even when they were succeeded on the political scene by center-left parties, by Bill Clinton in the United States, by Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, what these center-left parties did was they did not challenge the fundamental premise of the market faith of the Reagan-Thatcher years. They did not challenge the assumption that markets and market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. They did not challenge it. They accepted, and they consolidated that faith. They softened its harsh edges by trying to strengthen the safety net somewhat. But mainly what they offered was a greater emphasis on meritocracy, on mobility. I call it the rhetoric of rising. And they took as their political project perfecting the meritocracy so that the race would start, so that everyone could start the race at the same starting point. They didn't question the idea of society as a race. Another metaphor to see what they missed is the image of a ladder. What they offered is a political project, and by they I mean the mainstream center-left parties in most Western democracies. They said, we will help everyone have an equal chance to clamber up the ladder of success. But they didn't notice, or they didn't deal with the fact that the rungs on the ladder were growing further and further apart. So theirs was too limited a political project and an inadequate response to the deepening inequality. And so what we need now, I think, is an alternative mission. I think in particular, center-left parties need to rethink their mission and purpose, because what's happened in the absence of an effective response to inequality, and what's resulted from their rhetoric of rising, is that working people have been alienated from center-left parties and have been led to embrace right-wing authoritarian populist figures who offer hyper-nationalism, hostility to immigrants. And the center-left parties wonder how this happened. One of the reasons it happened is that they missed an insult that was implicit in the rhetoric of rising. They said, we're offering a more fair starting point for everyone. So why shouldn't low-income voters be in favor of that? Why shouldn't working people be in favor of that? But here's the insult they missed. If your main response to inequality is, say, improve yourself, go get a university degree, the insult is this: if you don't have a university degree, and if you're struggling in the new economy, your failure must be your fault. That's the insult implicit in a single-minded focus on the rhetoric of rising, on meritocracy and mobility as an answer to inequality. And so it's no wonder that by 2016, the Democratic Party in the United States, the Labour Party in Britain, the Social Democratic parties of Europe were more attuned to the interests and the values and the outlook of the professional classes, the credential classes, the well-educated classes, than they were to the interests and outlook of the working class voters who once constituted their base. And we saw this. We saw the divide in the vote between those with and without a university degree in the election of Trump. After one primary election victory, Trump said famously, "I love the poorly educated." He understood this. The educational divide in politics was created in large part by the center-left parties missing the insult they were delivering to working people. And it isn't only a matter of inequality and wage stagnation and job loss, because what they missed was they didn't see that work is not only about making a living. Work is also about honor and recognition. It's about the ability to contribute to the common good and to be recognized and honored for having done so. And when people feel that the work they do on those long rides, as you mentioned, Eduardo, on the buses or on the subways to work, and the hours that they work, when people feel that the work they do and the sacrifices that they make are not honored and respected and recognized by the wider society, when all the prestige goes to hedge fund managers or those who work in speculative finance, then there's something deeply demoralizing about that. And a sense of social exclusion runs deep. This, I think, not only the inequality in economic terms, but the lack of recognition and honor and appreciation leads to the resentment, to the sense of humiliation that makes right-wing authoritarian populist figures attractive, because they run against, they criticize these elites, and they offer a kind of pride. It's a false pride in the end, but they do offer a kind of revenge against the elites that becomes very attractive to people who rightly sense that elites look down on them.
It reminds me a book from Dostoevsky that I read. I don't know the name in English, but The Memory from the House of Death, something like that. When and he says that for the prisoners, he says that the worst torture that they could have, the worst sensation that they could feel, was that their work was worthless. They would work, and that would mean, nothing. It was not recognized. It was not something that would like come back for them. And that was the worst torture that could happen to someone. So
that's exactly on captures this theme. And what it suggests, Eduardo, as an alternative political project, because we need, after all, to think that through. We seem to agree on the diagnosis of what's gone wrong. What it suggests as an alternative is a political project that focuses less on arming people for meritocratic competition and focuses more on renewing the dignity of work, which goes to the Dostoevskian point that you just made. The dignity of work. We need a political agenda that affirms and renews and makes concrete an appreciation for the dignity of work. The work that everyone does, not only those who are well credentialed. I'm reminded of a moment, a poignant moment, toward the end of the life of Martin Luther King. Shortly before he was assassinated, he went to support some striking sanitation workers in Tennessee, garbage collectors. And what he said to them was this. He said, the person who picks up our garbage is, in the final analysis, as important as the physician, because if he doesn't do his work and do it well, disease will be rampant. And then he added this. He said, all labor has dignity. This was Martin Luther King. He understood the dignity of work. It was not only about the money and the money it takes to support a family. It was also about honor and recognition. Now, here's one possible source of hope. During the pandemic, I think the importance of the dignity of work perhaps came closer to public attention. The pandemic, in many ways, highlighted inequalities that existed before the pandemic. One of the most vivid of those inequalities was the divide between those of us who, during the pandemic, could do our jobs from home, and those who either lost their jobs or who, in order to perform their jobs, had to expose themselves to risk for the sake of the rest of us. So I'm thinking here, for example, not only of those who were working in the hospitals, caring for COVID patients, but think of delivery workers, grocery store clerks, home healthcare workers, nurse assistants, childcare workers, truckers, truck drivers. These are not the best paid or the most honored workers in our societies. And yet, during the pandemic, we began calling them essential workers, key workers. And we would even applaud for them sometimes at the end of the day. So this could be the beginning or an opening of a broader public debate about how to bring their pay and recognition into better alignment with the importance of the work they do. And there's no guarantee that this will happen, because the pandemic may recede and we may go back to business as usual. But noticing whom we were relying on most during the pandemic, I think, could be a starting point in a very concrete way for a broader public debate about how to renew the dignity of work.
Great. We're reaching the end of this great conversation. I could be here like learning with Michael for, hours and hours, but I'd like to finish with one biblical parable, which always brings uncomfort for people who reads it today, because it's a provocation about this market logic that we have, which is the parable of the vineyard workers, where you have a landowner that he hires men for a day of work. And first he hire the workers at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he paid them like a silver coin. And then and they're really happy because that's a good pay for their work. And then he hires some workers at noon, and then at 3 o'clock, and then at 5 o'clock. And at the end, he pays for everyone like one silver coin, which is something that was very well paid for their work. And on the beginning, everybody was happy about that. And then at the end, when they learn that the other ones who work less receive the same thing, they question him and say, hey, wait a minute, but they work less, we work more. So where's the meritocracy on this? And he said, hey, you were all happy about this, and this made you all with enough for what you needed and what you wanted. It's not exactly like that, the parable, but I'm putting conceptually. Right. So this seems to me like an ancient provocation about the concepts of justice and meritocracy. And it's so important that today, like 2,000 years after, we are still able to provocate these discussions and maybe understand that there has to be something beyond competition to make this world a better place for all of us to live. I always say that if you are someone that do your duties, you do the best you can for the common good. Right. Like the world must assure you have the conditions to live a life with dignity, a decent life, and a life that has all the possibilities to be like a happy life. So I pass to you for a final message. And also, if you want to make a comment about this biblical parable, because I think it's so interesting to have 2,000 years ago, a provocation like that to meritocracy.
Well, what it suggests, Eduardo, and I love the parable, is that we, as human beings, have been struggling with the question of justice and debating the meaning of justice for a very long time. We've covered some really big themes. We've talked about work. We've talked about the role of education. We've talked about meritocracy and about justice, and the long-standing debates about what justice consists in. Now, the subject I teach is philosophy, and a lot of people, when they think about philosophy, think that philosophy resides in the heavens, far beyond the world in which we live. Philosophers are people with their heads in the clouds, it's often thought. But I see philosophy differently. I think philosophy should reside in the city, where citizens gather and reason together about the common life they share. And I'm reminded of a very concrete experience I had in Brazil when I was able to travel to Brazil before the pandemic. On one of my visits to Rio, I visited a favela, Complexo Alemão, and I was taken to a community center there, where I met with a group of maybe 25 or 30 members of the community, many of them young people. And we had a dialogue, a discussion about their lives as they relate, those lives relate to big questions of justice, citizenship, self-government, having a voice in shaping the forces that govern our lives, the threat of violence, which was a constant presence in this community. And what struck me, Eduardo, and I know you've had similar experiences, what struck me engaging in this dialogue, especially with young people in the favela, was they were doing philosophy. For them, philosophy does not reside in the clouds or in the heavens. Debates about what makes for a just society, about how to contend with inequality, with violence, about what it means to seek the common good, about what it means to raise young people, what sort of education we should give our young people, and how they should look upon their fellow citizens and think about our mutual obligations. These questions, they are big philosophical questions, but they are also immediate practical questions that bear directly on the way we live our lives together. I found that discussion deeply moving and inspiring and hopeful, because what it suggested to me is that bringing together education, dialogue, and common spaces and public places that bring people together across different walks of life. This is the hope for democracy. Democracy is not only about voting every 4 years or 5 years. Democracy depends on nourishing arenas for civic education and dialogue and debate, learning the art of democratic discourse, learning the art of listening to one another, even where we disagree. So we began this conversation, Eduardo, discussing what justice means. For me, a just society is a society like that, a society where we don't agree on everything, but where we begin to cultivate the habit and the capacity to deliberate together as equals, as democratic citizens about the common good. The educational project you've launched, it can be a powerful source for this kind of society. And so I really feel honored to be in dialogue with you and to celebrate the project that you have launched, Eduardo.
Thanks so much. And people, this is the book you all should read. We have like a surprise for you in a moment, but this is a book you all should read. It's like it's a life changer. I can tell you it's a life changer because our life is programmed in this competition mode since the very early stages of our life. And this will make you question some certains you have about your life. Thank you so much. Now, Professor Michael Sandel, and please keep the good work and keep writing, because I need to read your new books. I have written all the others, so I need new books from you to read. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you so much.